Merci beaucoup. Alors déjà, c'est un petit peu la honte parce que le speaker d'après, c'est un Anglais qui, malgré le Brexit, va faire l'effort de parler en français. Et moi, je vais le faire en anglais. Mais bon, ça c'est la première chose, mais on y va. The second tough thing when you're fourth is you have to listen to the speeches of the first, how many were there before? 6, 7? So first of all, for me, the king of the jungle is the lion. But then the first speaker said, it's not a lion and he doesn't live in the jungle. And the other problem is the previous speaker said that we shouldn't talk about climate change with pictures and numbers, but I'm going to talk about climate changes with pictures and numbers. I really don't know what to do now, so I think I'll continue, right? Okay, so for me, the king of the jungle is the lion. Now let's look at how majestic, how dominating he is, right? But let's just take him for a ride, take 18 minutes, and we'll see where he'll end up in 18 minutes. Now, the angle we're going to take is climate crisis and rising hunger in the world. Now, starting with the lion and the jungle, and let's transpose this to human beings and nature. That's the angle we're going to take. We're going to focus on the relationship between both of them. It's a complex relationship of dominance and dependence. And even already we can start thinking about who really is the king. Of course, we've dominated nature for thousands of years. We've dominated fire, farming, industry, biotechnology. But we all know that we depend on nature for shelter, for air, for water, and for food. Now, we're going to drill down is this relationship of dependence, and we're going to go back in time, and we're going to go back in history. Now, it's interesting, but in 2011, a book was published by Eric Wood and Justin Sheffield from Princeton University called Drought. They went back in town through a lot of interesting research, looking at wood, nature, the circles in the wood, and they can go back in time and see what happened. And they've identified 10 civilizations that collapse because of drought. And what's interesting is we're going to talk about later, drought really is the biggest enemy of human civilization, because when water stops, soil dries out, basically cities die, civilization collapse, and actually people move on. So these are just a couple of examples of civilization that already collapse because of climate change, because of drought. As you can see, they happen through time, and they happen in every part of the globe. Start with ancient Egypt, the old kingdom of ancient Egypt. What people maybe don't know, but actually the floods of the Nile is something positive because it fertilizes the soil, and then you have good harvests. When the droughts came, the floods retracted the Nile, less harvest, less tax revenues for the pharaohs, the kingdom collapsed. A couple of years later, the Maya civilization, it's pretty well known that it collapsed because of climate change. Millions of them died because of lack of food and water. And a few years later, in China, the monsoon period was affected, and in Asia, 70% of the water actually falls within 3 months. But one thing we probably don't know, closer to our own time, is the war in Syria. And there's more and more evidence that shows that one of the contributing factors of the war in Syria was actually climate change. In 1998, before the war started, Syria experienced the biggest climate change in 500 years. Some people say probably 1,000 years. That led to millions of people moving into the city, put some pressures on the resources of the city, some tensions with authority, etc. And that very much fueled a lot of some of the conflicts that happened. Of course, there's other reasons, right? But that's a little piece of history that's interesting, and more of the historians are looking at that and saying that was most probably a contributing factor. Now, all of those ancient civilizations, you can't really say they were really responsible for what happened to them, right? I mean, they were victims, they were not actors of their own demise. But even back in time, history provides us with another example where human beings were the actors of their own collapse. And that's what happened in the Easter Island. So it's a little island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that actually had human beings. It used to be a highly thriving, organized society. It had writing, it had art, it had culture, it had a very complex social structure. They even had solar observatory to actually look at the sun. Now, in 1722, when James Cook, which was an English navigator, arrived, there was only 600 men, 30 women, and they were barely surviving. They were dying. Now, what happened? Well, what happened is basically they overexploited their resources. Now, it's a small island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You can't leave, so if you overexploit your resources, you run out of what you need to survive. Some people actually say that it's not verified that they were actually cutting the wood to actually build those statues. But they could see that actually going back in time and usually looking at the sediments. Now, what happened? And all of a historical debate what happened on that island, but it's the first time that the word ecocide arrived. Genocide, ecocide, basically, destruction of the environment, and therefore, at the end, destruction of people. Now, this was the past. Let's fast forward into the future. And this is where I'm going to use pictures where the previous speaker is going to be pretty angry with me, so I think I'll have a tough discussion during the cocktail. Anyway, we all know that there's been an exponential growth of human activity, and along that, of course, overexploitation of nature. A few pictures, logging, farming, industry. But at the same time, we've seen increases in disasters, earthquakes, floods, and wildfires. Now, if we, beyond the pictures, if we look at the numbers, these are the disasters, basically, if you compare 10 years from 1980 to 1999 and then to 2000, 2019, you're just seeing those numbers. The numbers of reported disasters increase, death, affected people, and U.S. economical loss. But if you look at the types of disaster, it's interesting because 90% of those disasters are climate-induced, climate change-induced. If you look at the types of disaster, I'm not going to go through all of them, but apart from mass movement, every single one has increased, and some of them have simply more than doubled, in simply 20 years. Now, we've seen on one side climate variability. Now let's look at this relationship. It was about climate crisis and rising hunger, and let's look at the relationship between climate variability and rising hunger. Forgot this slide. It's not only about what happens suddenly, it's about what happens slowly. Erosion, glacial melt, heat stress, pests and diseases, salination, sea level rises. Hopefully I'm on the right slide afterwards. Now let's go back to this relationship of dominance and see what that means today in our ability to actually feed ourselves and food and water. Okay? So statistical, you take a set of countries. On the left-hand side of the countries that are the most exposed to climate change. On the right-hand side, the countries that are the least exposed to climate change. What you actually see is there's a higher number of hungry people in people that are more exposed to climate change, both in terms of numbers of people, but also in terms of percentage. Now, how do you do that correlation? How do you explain food insecurity and climate change? This is the traditional pillars of food security that United Nations usually use, and food security is defined along 4 axes. The first one, pretty simple, is availability. You need to have food, right? So it's either domestic production, imports, you've got your food stocks, or you get food aid. You need to have food there. But that's not enough. You need to be able to access the food. If you're a household, you need to be able to access the food. So income, purchasing power, are you just producing your own food? Transport and market infrastructure, you need to reach the markets to be able to access the food, or sometimes food distribution. The last of the pillar was utilization, which is actually, can your body properly use the food? That very much depends on whether you have quality food, safe food, nutritious food, you have clean water, you're healthy, your body can actually process all the food. Those were originally the 3 main pillars. Recently, the United Nations added a 4th pillar, which is stability, which is if you want food security, you need to have stable availability of food, stable access of food, stable utilizations of food. And then you're going to tell me, okay, so what's the relationship with climate change? Well, actually, climate change affects the 4 of them, right? Because we know drought, the yield goes down, you produce less food. Access, prices go up. First of all, you have less food, so the prices go up on the market, but more imports. Utilization, we all know that those climate disasters affect hygiene, affect food safety, affects water. And stability, just taking an example, Mozambique, 16 weeks, so this is Mozambique. Look at what happened the past 18 months, right? It started with a drought, beginning of the conflict, then they got a hurricane. Conflict got worse after the cyclone, and more recently, they're getting water deficits. Okay, so all those 3 pillars or 4 pillars are affecting food insecurity. Now, if you look at all the types of disasters, they're not totally equal. This pretty much shows, which type of disasters affects the most agriculture, and it goes back to the beginning of the story. Drought is the most destructive. Now, let's just simply look at the number of hungry people in the world. Up until 2015, there were less people. There were less hungry people in the world. Went from 800 million to 606 million. Since 2014, for the first time in history, it's going back up. Not all linked to climate change. There's 3 main drivers of food insecurity: climate change, conflict, and economical downturn. That this big spike in 2019 is very much linked to COVID, but still, hunger is back on the rise. Now, this is a hunger map. This is a tool we actually use to monitor hunger around the world and to try and identify which are the areas where we need to actually do some interventions. So it's near real-time monitoring. It uses modern technologies and artificial intelligence. On the left-hand side, you currently have the number of people that are currently hungry in the world, close to 1 billion, 0.85. You got the alert system. So if you see on the right, these are the alerts. So we know there's a correlation between conflict, COVID, but also those climate alerts. So we have those climate alerts. And actually, it's color-coded. So if you're in the red areas, this is where there are the most people that are hungry in the world. Okay, and then you can zoom on a country, zooms into Yemen. And actually, so we're starting more and more, not only to look at the amount of people that are hungry in the world, but trying to look where there's climate change, conflict, economics, so we know pretty much where to go. I don't know if you looked at the news recently, but the IPCC is actually the commission that actually every day meet a bunch of experts, and they meet quite regularly, and they do their famous report before the different conferences. They never said until now. Until now, they said, if we change our habits, we can avoid the problem. First time ever 3 weeks ago that they says it's irreversible. We need to adapt ourselves. Okay, just came out, but all of us knew it, but it was never published. Okay. Now, fast forward into tomorrow and the projections of what's going to happen by 2050. This is the projection of the proportion of cropland exposed to drought around the world, and even in Europe, what you're saying here. So France is in dark orange, okay? So 40 to 50% of our crops will be under drought by 2050. It pretty much affects every type of cereals. And then if we finish, this is about the water and, of course, the water scarcity and the water stress by 2050. So doing the loop back, we start with those civilizations that collapsed because of drought. We're looking at the eco side, and we're looking at what's happening more at a global scale, but there's nowhere else to go. So I'm finishing with the king of the jungle. Remember, he was majestic. He was dominating at the beginning of the presentation. He doesn't look too good now. So as a cheeky conclusion, I think there's maybe one solution, which is we destitute the king and we institute a queen, because maybe we should have a queen. Thank you.